Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us for the fourth installment of the Flatten the Curve of Inequality webinar series. Tonight's webinar is titled Support for Individuals Experiencing Homelessness. Each webinar in our series will address how the county's response to COVID-19 is not just about flattening the curve of infection rates, but also the inequities that are exacerbated by this pandemic. Before we begin, we have a few logistical and programmatic notes about how our evening will be structured. Tonight, we are offering ASL and Spanish interpretation. Kayleen and Jennifer with Deaf Community Services of San Diego will be providing ASL interpretation for tonight. They will be trading off interpretation. While we are sharing screen, please click View Options at the top of your screen and select side-by-side mode, and be sure the interpreter who is currently signing is on screen for you. Instructions are also in the chat. Andrea Rocha will be providing Spanish interpretation tonight. Please dial 833-548-0282, meeting ID 219-075-8904#, and mute your computer and telephone.
Esta noche estamos ofreciendo interpretación en español. Marque al 833-548-0282, código de acceso 219-075-8904 y el signo del gato para audio en español, y silencie su computadora y su teléfono. Si tiene una pregunta para un panelista, envíe su pregunta con el botón Preguntas y Respuestas, o por las siglas en inglés Q y A. No dude en escribir sus preguntas y comentarios en español.
If you have a question for a panelist, please submit your question using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. It would be helpful to include who your question should be directed to. Please feel free to write down your questions and comments in Spanish as well. We will do our best to answer as many questions as possible, but may not be able to get to all of them due to the time constraints tonight. You might also notice that there's a chat box. All messages sent to the chat box can only be seen by our panelists. Attendees will not be able to message one another in this webinar tonight. If you want to send affirmations or commentary, you're welcome to do that in the chat. If you have any tech questions, please direct them to the chat. Someone from our staff will be monitoring the chat for technical questions and will assist you if you need help. But again, if you have any questions for our panelists, please submit them using the Q&A function down below. Finally, when you leave the webinar, you will be directed to a survey asking for your feedback. Please share your feedback with us so that we can improve the experience for others on our subsequent webinars. I know you're all eager and ready, so let's just get started. Tonight, we're going to cover ways to support individuals experiencing homelessness during COVID-19. We'll take a look at efforts that our state and local governments have put forth to assist individuals experiencing homelessness. There will be a Q&A session after our conversation with our panelists. At the end of our webinar, our panelists will share a little bit more about how you all can take action on the issues that you heard about tonight. Homelessness has been something our state and local governments have been working towards aiding for many years now. COVID-19 has left individuals experiencing homelessness at greater risk for contracting the infection. This has really re-emphasized the need to deepen our social safety net and provide long-term solutions to aid individuals experiencing homelessness. San Diegans should not be worried about finding safe, secure, and stable housing and resources, especially not during a global pandemic. We must ensure that our unsheltered neighbors have access to housing year-round because we know that housing is a human right. We must push our local elected officials to provide long-term solutions to help individuals experiencing homelessness. And today, our panelists will share what our local governments and state governments' response to COVID-19 has been and what you can do to ensure that our region is a more equitable place to live in. Our panelists tonight are Michele Whitson, Executive Director and Managing Attorney of Think Dignity. Think Dignity is a homeless advocacy agency in San Diego, California, with a mission to inspire, empower, and organize the local community to advance basic dignity to those living on the streets. She joined the Think Dignity staff in 2017 as the staff attorney and currently serves as their executive director. SD, unit of participatory defense. Next, we're joined by Jonathan Markovitz, staff attorney at the ACLU of San Diego and Imperial Counties. At the ACLU, Jonathan has worked on economic justice issues, including the criminalization of homelessness. Before starting law school, Markovitz earned a PhD in sociology at the University of California, San Diego, and taught courses in sociology, communication, ethnic studies, and writing at UCSD and other universities as well. He has written and taught about race, gender, popular culture, social movements, and collective memory. Markovitz is the author of Legacies of Lynching, Racial Violence and Memory, and Racial Spectacles, Explorations in Media, Race, and Justice. Last but not least, we're joined tonight by Eve Garrow, homelessness policy analyst and advocate at the ACLU of Southern California. Eve joined the ACLU of Southern California in November of 2014. She is a homelessness policy analyst and advocate for the Dignity for All project, which seeks to promote policies that prevent and reduce homelessness and end the criminalization of people who are unhoused. And just as a quick reminder, just as a quick reminder for our panelists, please make sure to speak slowly and make pauses so our interpreters can catch up. So as I kind of mentioned in the beginning, we know that individuals experiencing homelessness are at a greater risk of contracting COVID-19. Michele, can you tell us how individuals experiencing homelessness in San Diego have been impacted by COVID-19?
Hi, Savannah. That's a really incredible question to start off with. I think it's worth noting that San Diego has had the fourth largest homeless population in the nation for quite some time now. So you can imagine at the onset of this pandemic, it's really highlighted some of the glaring gaps that are in our system that have ineffectively provided the assistance that our homeless population needs, specifically during this kind of health crisis. And another thing I'd like to note is that the last point in time count indicated that more than half of our homeless population was living unsheltered, which leaves them more at a risk, right? Left without proper safety measures to protect their health, especially during this time. So what we're seeing on the streets is folks really being impacted in ways that kind of exemplify the already glaring inequities that are for the lack of services that we have in San Diego, specifically for the unsheltered homeless population. What we've been seeing is that many have been subject to quality of life offenses, arrests for quality of life offenses. For example, folks living on the streets or living in their vehicles have often been ticketed for doing so. That this is the kind of relentless enforcement and criminalization of poverty that not only perpetuates poverty, but it's also a showing of the blatant disregard for human life, specifically against federal recommendations that really put this already vulnerable population at risk of exposure through congregated facilities such as jails, and unnecessarily physical contact between folks in close quarters. So we're seeing, with the population that we specifically represent, we are seeing a lot of folks continuing to be criminalized during this time. But more specifically too is a highlight of the inavailability of resources specifically for the homeless population. So many service providers have had to shut down operations. So we're in a space where the already vulnerable population with already lack of resources has really seen a diminished amount of resources available to them to find shelter, to find medical assistance for maybe if they're exhibiting symptoms, and to find a safe space to just be during this time. The homeless population really doesn't have the availability like the rest of us to kind of, abide by the stay-at-home orders, or to stay in a place where they don't have frequent interactions with folks. So again, with homelessness, we're seeing homeless folks being disproportionately affected by the pandemic, and by some of the effects that the pandemic has caused.
Thank you for sharing, Michele. You know, you kind of touched upon the lack of resources and services that are available to individuals experiencing homelessness in San Diego. Can you tell us about some important steps for our city and county to take to ensure that they are really addressing the root causes of homelessness within their policy and their fiscal budgets as well?
Yes, of course. That's a really great question. You know, again, as I mentioned, and when I started this conversation, I really wanted to highlight that San Diego is the 4th largest homeless population in the nation, right? And that's behind some really huge populations like LA, New York, Seattle. And I think we've held this spot for quite a while now, and that's because we, as a county, have not effectively addressed homelessness and its root causes, as you've mentioned, right? So when we think about the issue of homelessness, it's really the end result of systematic failures, right? So it's a combination of so many things. So we see these intersections of wage inequity, of the skyrocketing cost of living, the unavailability of affordable housing, and really addressing what does affordable housing look like, right? And so so when we think about how we can hold our elected officials, our city, our county, responsible for ensuring that these root causes are addressed, and really managing a budget that directly addresses all of these issues, we have to be very adamant in holding our elected officials accountable for doing just that, right? Implementing policies that address the immediate, but more importantly, the long-term needs to defend the basic human rights of our homeless community. I think what we've seen over the years are kind of short-term fixes for an issue that has been a long-term issue and will continue to be a long-term issue if we don't, navigate through more sustainable means of addressing the root causes. And so some of these, if we talk about specifically currently what they could do, there are a number of different things specifically during this pandemic, right? Is making investments in non-congregate forms of shelter is going to be super important to ensuring that the health and safety of not just the general public, but the homeless population in particular. I think that we need to really, put our money towards implementing and developing affordable housing and long-term solutions. So not just bridge shelters, right? While those are incredible temporary fixes, they don't address, the long-term solutions. And so what we should be looking at and what we should be investing our money in is for long-term solutions for affordable housing, so that folks can have the sustainability to continue to move up within society in the most effective way. And most importantly, if we talk about, I know that we're going to talk about criminalization later on, but I think it's worth highlighting here as well, is the heavy enforcement on low-level offenses in San Diego, and specifically, as I mentioned earlier, the quality of life offenses and how damaging it can be for someone who has thousands of dollars of fines and fees to pay off, and also a criminal record, right? As we know, folks with criminal records, this just creates, and this kind of criminalization only further perpetuates poverty and further entrenches folks into homelessness. So if we're ticketing folks and giving them criminal convictions for sleeping on the street or sleeping on the sidewalk or sleeping in their vehicle, they're left with a criminal record that further creates barriers for them to access resources, right? We know that with a criminal record, folks have difficulty accessing subsidized housing. They have difficulty accessing employment opportunities, applying for financial aid to get into school, accessing county resources. So it's really counterintuitive to continue to enforce these quality of life offenses the way that we're currently enforcing it here in San Diego. So we really need to take a step back and really think about decriminalization, right? Put less money into using law enforcement as a means to address the issues of homelessness, and put more money into social services so we can really address the root causes, right? So we can put more money into the community, we can put more money into social services, more money into mental health facilities, more money into education, more money into making sure that folks have employment opportunities available to them. And so this will really address some of these root causes to really pose as a safety net for folks before they even enter into homelessness. But also, while folks are experiencing homelessness, we can provide these additional resources that really aid in really providing more holistic support for their needs.
Thank you, Michelle. You kind of touched upon the fact that, we need to really widen the resources that are being offered by our local and state officials, but have there been any responses by our local government or state that have been encouraging and really try to get at the root causes of homelessness? And if not, what would you like to see our local government begin to do?
Yes, of course, there have been investments for this particular issue, but what we're looking at, as I mentioned earlier, is I think that the investments have been in short-term solutions, right? Easy fixes, Band-Aid solutions, so that we can get the problem off of the streets. So if we don't see it, we don't think about it, right? But I think what we really need to do is push for, again, those long-term solutions and ensuring that we continue this funding in a meaningful way, so that oftentimes what happens is this kind of funding only lasts for a certain amount of time for specific programs for, as I mentioned, a duration of time. What we really need to do is ensure that where we're putting our money is into these long-term solutions, and that really don't further create barriers for folks. As I mentioned to you just a bit ago about the programs, right? A lot of the times the money is put into programs that have a lot of restrictions or barriers into accessing these resources, right? So for instance, maybe you have to be between a certain age range. Maybe you have to have suffered from some kind of mental illness or battle with substance abuse. The issue with having programs that have very specific requirements for entering their program is that it leaves a lot of folks falling through the gaps because they don't meet requirements for any particular program to help assist them with their needs. So what we should be doing is allocating these resources and investing specifically into low barrier to no barrier programs, so that we can really provide the kind of support that can encourage stability in folks' lives, so that we can provide meaningful access to these resources that are specific to their needs.
Thank you so much for your insight, Michelle. Before we move on to our next panelist, I want to remind attendees to please write any questions they have in that question and answer function, either in English or Spanish, at the bottom of your screen. Jonathan, what kind of legal problems have people experiencing homelessness faced during the crisis? And has there been any litigation to address or prevent these problems, either now or in the past?
First, let me just say thank you for inviting me to the panel. It's really a pleasure to be on a panel with such great colleagues and advocates addressing such a crucial issue, dealing with some of the most vulnerable people in our community at a moment where they are more vulnerable than ever. When thinking about the kinds of legal issues that the homeless face, or that people who are unhoused face in the county, I think it's important to think about the mindset that the county and local jurisdictions, local cities, have had when thinking about the homeless for a very, very long time. And this touches on exactly the issues that Michelle was talking about, which is the criminalization of the homeless. I think that the main way that local officials for a very long time have seen the problem of homelessness isn't to focus on homelessness itself as the problem, but to focus on homeless people, people who are unhoused is the problem. And once you define the problem not as a housing crisis, not as a crisis of poverty, but as a crisis of people who are a problem, then the kind of knee-jerk and automatic response to them is to that problem is to get rid of the people. And that happens through criminalization. It happens through letting people know that there are parts of the city and parts of the county that they just aren't welcome. It happens by destroying their property. And for all of these measures, the ACLU, Think Dignity, other organizations that have been fighting to advocate for people who are unhoused have for very many years been fighting back and pushing back. The ACLU about 10 years ago won a settlement to stop the destruction of homeless people's property without notice, without going through proper procedures. As a result of that settlement, there are now homeless storage lockers that Think Dignity manages. I think that the agreement not to destroy homeless people's property may not always be honored, but it's at least there, and there are ways to try to enforce it. There, at almost the same time, there was a settlement that other lawyers sued for and got, which prevented the people from being arrested for sleeping on sidewalks overnight. I think it was from 9 p.m. until 5:30 a.m. Just a couple of years ago, Disability Rights California sued to stop the enforcement of a couple of laws involving people sleeping in their cars or parking their RVs overnight. And they succeeded in getting the vehicle habitation law, the law that says that you can't sleep in your car, declared unconstitutional at a preliminary phase and getting an injunction against its enforcement. So it's a really great success. All of these things have been really important legal battles and legal successes. But the last one is, I think, especially telling because the city of San Diego's response to that preliminary injunction saying that the vehicle habitation law was unconstitutional was just to write a new law. They repealed the old one as was appropriate. And then they changed some of the phrasing and introduced a new law that may get rid of some of the most glaringly obvious constitutional problems. It still allows for criminalizing homeless people who are sleeping in their cars, for doing something that in a public health crisis where people are faced with a highly infectious disease actually provides a whole lot of safety. So, and I should say that this criminalization of the homelessness of the homeless, as Michele mentioned, is something that has actually only been exacerbated during the current crisis. So at a moment in time where people around the country have been fighting like crazy to keep people out of jails and out of prisons, because these are deadly environments right now. They're congregate living spaces where people can't possibly come close to practicing safe social distancing. At a moment in time where people have been trying to get people out of jails, out of prisons, city of San Diego has doubled down on sending them right back into those burning buildings. They have, iNewsSource a couple of weeks ago reported that I think it was for illegal lodging, there are twice as many citations that were issued during the current pandemic than there were during the same time span last year. Other offenses targeting the homeless have also been ramped up instead of reduced. So I think that all of the legal battles against criminalization are essential. They have to keep going, but until the county and the city change their mindset about just what the nature of the housing crisis is, I think that we're playing a game of whack-a-mole. We'll keep fighting individual laws, individual kinds of enforcement, and other kinds of criminalization measures take their place. So litigation is essential, it's important, but we need big fundamental changes in how the city and local jurisdictions are approaching the problem.
Thank you, Jonathan. You know, we kind of talked about litigation in that last question, but could you possibly tell us a little bit more what the policy response has been from our local city and county officials to ensure that the needs of individuals experiencing homelessness are met during this time?
I think the quick response is just to say woefully inadequate. So there have been responses, but I think that the primary response, or the primary response to think about, hasn't been one that involves meeting the needs of the unhoused, but increasing their desperation. And that is the increased enforcement of criminalization measures. Beyond that, I think that there's some good news, but actually let me go back to another part of bad news first, which is that I think it's really crucial for people to understand that the unhoused population is facing a crisis in terms of the ways that they've survived in the past that are no longer available to them. And by that I mean that there are things like churches that have stopped providing for food, that have stopped donating meals because of the crisis. People who bring food, individuals who bring food to the homeless, have faced serious COVID-19 related fears, so have stopped doing that. So there's a real kind of struggle just for basic survival. The head of one of the local shelters recently said that the homeless are facing serious literal starvation. That seems to have started to be addressed in recent weeks, but I think largely by private foundations and nonprofits, not by the city itself, and not by the county. The county has provided a number of beds. Something like 1,700 hotel rooms have been made available. It hasn't done a whole lot to make sure that people are taking advantage of all of those spaces. They also have moved people in, the city has moved people into the San Diego Convention Center, where there's something like 1,300 people who sleep there every night. So people, some percentage of the population has housing, it has shelter available to them. That's a congregate environment too, where social distancing is at best difficult. People also share bathroom facilities, so it's far from clear that it's a safe environment.
Thank you. What type of we talked about decriminalization of homelessness. Why does the decriminalization play such an important role in homelessness prevention?
So I think that Michele addressed some of this, but it has to do with the problem with criminalization itself, which is just that people are, criminalization is, during the best of times, criminalization is counterproductive and cruel. During a pandemic, it only increases desperation. It only serves to send people into a spiral of debt, a spiral where they can't, where fines pile up, they spend time in court, they spend time in jail. That makes it hard to get or keep a job. It does nothing more than increase desperation for people who are already desperate, to increase a really vicious cycle of poverty and of homelessness. And the way that you stop that cycle, or a key method of stopping that cycle, is to stop criminalizing, stop arresting people.
Thank you for your insight, Jonathan. Before the next panelist, please be sure to ask any questions you might have in that little Q&A function down below. Can you tell us a little bit more about the statewide response to provide support for individuals experiencing homelessness?
Hi there. Yes, I certainly can. And thank you so much for inviting me to this great panel. So I'm glad that we're talking a little bit about the statewide response, because if you think about homelessness if you think about the root cause of homelessness as being the lack of affordable housing, and it really is. So when somebody cannot afford their rent and they don't have family to move in with, generally their only option is to become homeless, to either live in a congregate shelter or more likely in California to live on the streets, because about 70% of our unhoused population is actually unsheltered. That's because we lack enough affordable housing to meet the needs of everyone. In most, I'm not sure what the waiting list is like in San Diego. Maybe one of the other panelists knows, but in Orange County and Los Angeles County, it's upwards of about 10 years. And that's if you can get on a waiting list. And generally you can't, because they stay closed for years. If they were open all of the time, so many people would be on the list that nobody would ever, when you got onto the list, you would never get to the top of the list because the list would be that long. So they managed the list by just closing it. So imagine being evicted or becoming unhoused in some way, and then realizing that you have absolutely no access to affordable housing, and you have no alternative but to be homeless. In general, our housing solutions have been funded by the federal government and by our states. And it's really the massive defunding of our affordable housing programs that have led to our contemporary homelessness crisis. So back in 1970, several decades ago, this is hard to imagine, but there was actually a surplus of affordable housing. So if you couldn't afford your rent, if you were very low income, extremely low income, and you were eligible for affordable housing, you would get it. And homelessness was extremely rare in 1970. During the 1980s, we saw, during the Reagan administration, we saw massive cuts to our affordable housing programs, both at the federal level and at our state levels. And I'm telling you, we've just never recovered. So if the problem, if part of the root problem is really state level funding, the solution has to include reinvesting, correcting those mistakes, and reinvesting in our affordable housing programs at both the state and the federal level. I will say that in my opinion, in my humble opinion, we're not going to make much progress at the federal level with the current administration, but we have an ostensibly progressive state, right? The state of California, with the governor who, in his State of the State address this year, identified homelessness and our affordable housing crisis as the state's top priorities. So we do have a window of opportunity to make some progress at the state level. I'll just talk about a couple of windows of opportunity that have opened at the state level. These are actually state-federal collaborations that are making somewhat of an impact, but more importantly, I just think they open a window of opportunity for continued advocacy for more. So, since the COVID-19 pandemic, Governor Newsom has allocated FEMA money, so federal funding to offer, and I think McKelly mentioned this, but to offer very vulnerable people living in congregate shelters and encampments motel rooms through a program called Project Roomkey. And what this does is that the state distributes money to the local level. So there's actually an opportunity to advocate at the local level too, and to make sure that your local government is actually spending this money down in a timely fashion, because honestly, lives are at stake, right? If we leave vulnerable people with underlying health conditions or older adults living in congregate living situations, where they're at an increased risk of exposure to COVID-19, it could mean their life. And being able to live in a motel room where you have your own bathroom, you have your own bed, your own room, where you can safely self-isolate like the rest of us, is really an important intervention. So that program is underway as we speak. It's been implemented extremely slowly in some areas, like I said. So there is advocacy to be done. And then further, the governor has committed $600 million in CARE Act funding for motel conversions. So for the state and local governments to buy up some of these motels during the crisis, during the pandemic, and convert those rooms into permanent affordable housing, permanent supportive housing. So maybe studio apartments or one-bedroom apartments. And there's quite a bit of energy at the state level among progressive legislators to make Project Roomkey permanent, to ensure that people who have been moved into these motel rooms don't return to congregate shelters or don't return to encampments or to the streets once this program is over. So a couple of problems with this program, however, is that like most programs that the state, most funding that the state has passed, it's too little and it's time limited, like Magali said. When you're talking about permanent housing, one-time funding, one-shot funding, which is what the CARES Act funding and the FEMA funding are both one-time funding allocations, is not going to work. It needs to be funded over the long term. We need sustainable funding sources. It's going to be like as important as it is for the folks who benefit from this program. It's really a drop in the bucket. So, for example, the Project Roomkey program is reaching about 15,000 people throughout California. That's 10% of our homelessness population. It's really a small number of people. When you consider how the scale of the problem. The CARES Act funding, the state now has estimated that it will result in 6,000 new homes. So it's not even going to cover everyone that is eligible for Project Roomkey or who is a Project Roomkey recipient. So clearly we have more advocacy to do to expand these programs and to make them permanent.
Thank you for all the information, Eve. You mentioned that FEMA and the CARES Act have really, kind of put homelessness at the forefront of many of our budget decision making. What can we do to ensure that the needs of individuals experiencing homelessness stay at the forefront of our policy conversations and budget making decisions past COVID-19?
So this is a great question, and I've really been thinking about it. I think number one, as advocates, we can't let ourselves fall into a couple of traps. We can't just give legislators and the governor a pat on the back for policies or legislation that creates really incremental change. This has been the pattern over the last, I'll say, 10 years when the state really started to wake up and say, we need to start investing in affordable housing. It's always been very small amounts. It's been very incremental. And what has happened? I mean, homelessness has actually increased, maybe not as fast as it would have otherwise. But it has not solved the problem, and it hasn't even come close. This last year, California experienced an over 20,000 person increase in homelessness. I was just looking this up before the webinar, and just in raw numbers, That's more people than the increase in every other state in the union combined. I mean, we have a really bad problem here, but we actually have, like I said, windows of opportunity, because we do have a fairly progressive state that seems to care about the program or to care about the problem. We need as advocates to keep pushing our state legislators and the governor to do better. So I think a couple of things that we can do is, number one, demand sustainable revenue streams. No more of these, like one-time revenue streams, one shot. It's just not going to work if we're serious about investing in affordable housing. This is equally important. Let's not fall into the scarcity mode, which oftentimes our legislators, our policymakers try to force us into when they say, when they will tell you something like, okay, Eve, so you want more funding for affordable housing to end homelessness. You tell me the other program for poor people that you want us to cut so that we can fund your program. This program, right? No, we're not going to fall into that. One thing I want to say is that I really love and this is related. I really love the title of this series, Flattening the Curve of Inequality, because at the same time that our nation and state were busy slashing affordable housing programs, defunding affordable housing, we experienced a massive transfer of wealth to the top 1% and really the top 1/10 of 1%. And that's the zero-sum game. We don't need to be talking about defunding other important services that people living in poverty need. We need to be talking about tax reform, because the top 1% are hoarding most of the wealth and most of the resources and most of the power in this country at the expense of people who are forced to live and die on the street. That's not right. It's immoral. It's cruel, and we really need to start, I think, pushing our legislators when they try to trap us in this sort of like scarcity frame. We need to push them to start thinking about tax reform, which, think about it, that's a harder ask for them. I'm sure it seems to them that it's politically safer to take funding away from poor people who are less likely to vote and have less political power and are not part of the donor class than it is to start talking about tax reform and flattening the curve, literally, honestly, flattening the curve of inequality. But that's what they need to start doing if we're going to solve this problem. So yeah, I mean, these are the kinds of talking points and the kinds of issues that I think we need to make part of the state level discussion about how to end the homelessness problem, because the way we've been approaching it with this incremental approach is just not going to work.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for your insight and expertise. We're now going to transition to take some questions from the audience. And due to some time constraints, we will not be able to address every single question tonight, but we'll do our best to choose a diverse set of questions. So the first question we have is actually addressed to all panelists, so feel free, whoever feels comfortable, to take it. Is coordination among the organizations and agencies that are supporting those experiencing homelessness getting any better? We've been hearing it might be improving, but still so many people are in need.
Can I just, I want to answer like more broadly and let one of the other panelists talk about coordination in San Diego County. But this is another sort of discourse that drives me crazy, because oftentimes policymakers like to promote the idea that it's not that we don't have enough resources. It's that the resources that we have, that we just have to do a better job coordinating among the different service providers. But I can tell you that the people I know who are on housing lists, so for example, one woman I was talking to yesterday who has terminal cancer, and she's on the list for permanent supportive housing, and she was just told by her case manager that there are 3,000 people ahead of her in line, and now she's telling me, well, I think I'll die before I get to the top of that list and ever have my own home again, right? I mean, coordination is not going to solve the problem of the lack of affordable housing and the lack of resources currently, because our policymakers are not willing to do what it takes to change the situation and to create those funding streams. It's not going to solve that. So I just want to mention that. I'm not saying that coordination can't be important, but sometimes I feel like it's used as a distraction from the real problem. And local governments and continuums of care spend an awful lot of their energy coordinating services as best they can.
Thank you, Eve. Michele, I believe this question is directed towards you. Do you work closely with the regional task force on the homeless or Downtown Fellowship or Uplift?
We don't work directly with either of those organizations, but we do partner, with a lot of the homeless advocacy agencies here in San Diego to, maybe not in specific ways, but kind of, in ways to quote unquote coordinate our efforts, but not specifically.
Thank you. Jonathan, this question is for you. I know you kind of touched upon it in your answers earlier, but is the county still criminalizing homelessness in the same way?
Yeah, and I think Michele can talk about this in probably even more detail than I can, but criminalization from all reports has been exacerbated, not reduced during the pandemic.
Thank you, Jonathan. Is there a consensus among homeless advocates of what 4 questions on policy improvements that the mayoral candidates should respond to? That question is directed to anybody who would like to answer. I can repeat the question if that helps. Is there any sort of questions or policy improvements that you believe the mayoral candidates in San Diego should really be taking upon?
I think that if we're looking at, as I mentioned earlier, homelessness has really been a pressing issue in San Diego for such a long time now. So for mayoral candidates, I think that it's going to be super important to kind of even more so press the issue of homelessness and identify what kinds of things they look at as solutions for later on down the line, because we've seen what doesn't work here in San Diego, right? We've seen it for a decade now, even more so. And so, I think all of the panelists have mentioned that these kind of short-term Band-Aid solutions that the county and the city has been implementing over this time period. So in identifying the next elected official who's really going to take charge, and really, if we're looking at changing San Diego and decreasing homelessness in San Diego, we've got to ensure that whoever is going to be the next mayor really addresses how intentionally and meaningfully and effectively they are going to address homelessness, right? So that includes a lot of the things that we spoke about today, right? We need to ask them how, kind of what their stance is on the decriminalization of these quality of life offenses, so that we don't continue to perpetuate poverty by funneling folks through the criminal justice system in a way that only further entrenches them into homelessness and into chronic homelessness. We need to talk about what kind how they plan on utilizing funding resources to make sure that we can come up with long-term effective solutions, right? What are their ideas on how to provide long-term stable housing for folks, affordable housing, and really identifying what does affordable housing look like, right? Are we talking about median income for a particular city, which oftentimes is too high for folks to still, it's still not in line with the wages that they're receiving, right? So what does affordable housing look like? And really diving deep into these questions that oftentimes we hear these buzzwords and coin terms that folks use specifically on political platforms, right? Because it sounds like it's kind of moving the needle, but we really need to invest in ourselves to understand these issues so that we can ask these mayoral candidates the hard questions about really identifying exactly what it is they plan on doing to ensure that we can tackle the issue of homelessness in a way that's more effective than we've been doing.
Thank you, Michele.
Can I just add that the criminalizing homelessness so often happens at the city level. And so I do think it's so important, like Michele said, to put pressure on city councils and mayors. And I would say that, one question would be, do you pledge to decriminalize homelessness if you are elected? And really hold your local elected officials to account, because so often this is like a matter of parochial politics where cities want to be meaner than other cities around them so that people will just decide, people who are unhoused will just decide to go live somewhere else. And it's cruel. It's a form, like everybody on the panel said, it's a form of state violence. It's a form of persecution against our most vulnerable community members. And we really need to start holding our local elected officials responsible, because this is, I feel this is mostly a local issue.
Thank you, Eve and Michele. Michele, could you comment on current resources for homeless families with school-age children?
Sure, there are some resources available to folks. One in particular, an organization that we've at Think Dignity have worked very closely with is the Monarch School. So I'm not sure if folks are familiar. This is a school that's specifically dedicated for families experiencing homelessness, and it's a really incredible institution that provides wraparound services to folks. There are also, other organizations such as TAY academies around the county that really provide support for unaccompanied youth, but also school-age children. Usually in most schools as well, if we're talking about school-age children, they usually have an advocate dedicated at their particular school dedicated to providing resources specifically for homeless children.
Thank you for sharing, Michele. I think this question is for anybody on the panel, but how can we protect the rights of folks experiencing homelessness to vote in the coming election, especially if they don't have addresses where they can receive mail-in ballots?
I want to clarify if this person is speaking specifically to homeless individuals that don't have addresses for mail-in ballots, because there's this common misconception that homeless folks can't vote when they actually can. So they can register to vote, and they, as long as they have a designated mailing address, there are a number of organizations in San Diego where homeless folks can receive their mail. And so they don't even need to have a residence to put their address. They just need to simply input, if they're living on the streets, they can input the cross streets. So if they're literally unsheltered, they can input the cross streets. So there's this misconception that homeless folks can't vote, but they actually can. And I know here at Think Dignity, we've worked with with the registrar of voters to help to register homeless individuals to vote, included them in lobby visits to ensure that their voices are being heard, specifically during such important times.
Thank you for your insight. Eve, can you tell us a little bit more about what kind of systemic changes can be made, can prevent people from becoming homeless?
Sure. They're actually the same types of changes that we've been talking about. So affordable housing is a great anti-homelessness policy, right? If people who qualified for affordable housing had access to it, the way that affordable housing works is that generally you pay 30% of your income to rent and the government pays the remainder. If your income goes down, your rent goes down. If your income goes down to zero, your rent goes down to zero. Therefore, it's really impossible to be evicted from affordable housing due to lack of ability to pay. You could get evicted for some other reason, but you cannot get evicted for lack of ability to pay. So it's a great anti-homeless policy, which is why we had very little homelessness in 1970, is that people who qualified for, all of those people who are out on the streets right now or living in shelters, in 1970, they would have had their own apartments, their own affordable apartments. So, I mean, that is a great anti-homelessness policy. I know that there are a lot of, there are several different ideas floating around about rent relief when like the eviction moratoriums end in California. I mean, that's very similar to affordable housing, right? Rent relief would probably entail the government paying your rent, or at least paying a portion of your rent so that you aren't evicted. It would essentially be an expansion of our existing affordable housing programs. I would be very supportive of any of those kinds of interventions as long as people don't have to pay the subsidies back. As long as they don't have to pay it back. When you think about low-income people, they already, can barely afford their rent, and expecting them to pay their rent once the subsidies are over, and then also to pay back the subsidies that's a recipe for disaster. So those are a couple of ideas. Just expand our affordable housing program, or in one of two ways, in the traditional way or through rent relief, which might mean shallower subsidies, but enough funding to get people through so that they aren't evicted during the pandemic.
Thank you, Eve. Michele, are you aware of any structural or procedural barriers that exist for unhoused folks to access employment if they decide to seek it? And what is being done to address those barriers?
Yeah, certainly. I would say the barriers to employment are some of the issues that we highlighted, throughout this webinar. Specifically, I would mention, the criminalization, the hyper-criminalization of quality life offenses and poverty. As I mentioned, while folks are being criminalized for low-level offenses, these are offenses such as sleeping on the sidewalk, sleeping on the street, sleeping in their vehicles, right? These are so that they can conduct life-sustaining activities. Folks are being criminalized for. I think that there's this misconception that people are just getting tickets for these. No, but people are actually getting criminal convictions for these issues, for these crimes, leaving them with misdemeanors. And what happens is this puts them in, if I can give an example, so somebody gets a ticket for encroaching on the sidewalk, basically, sleeping on the sidewalk or having their items on the sidewalk. What happens is they're hit with a misdemeanor. a misdemeanor that they often plea out to. So they plead guilty to, just so that they can leave jail typically. And now they have a criminal record. They're often put on probation for the minimum of 3 years, right? And so what a criminal conviction does, it really just creates additional barriers to accessing these resources, right? We know that with, while you're on probation with a criminal record, you're really restricted from accessing so many things and doing so many things. If I can give an example specifically, I had a client when I first started working at Think Dignity, is that she received multiple tickets for encroaching on the sidewalk. So she was on probation for a number of different separate convictions for this particular charge. What happened was she ended up getting into housing. Let me back up. As a condition of the probation for encroachment, there is often, they would often tack on what's called a stay away order. So a stay away order would require that folks stay away from particular areas. Oftentimes it's where they were staying at the time that they were cited. Typically this is the downtown area, right? If anyone knows anything about the downtown area, this is really the hub of homeless serving agencies. And so she actually got into housing, but couldn't get into the housing because there was a stay away order that prevented her from accessing that particular shelter bed. And moreover, she was actually a nurse, but couldn't pay the fee so that she could renew her license because of the criminal conviction, right? So this is what we're seeing when we talk about how criminalization only further perpetuates poverty. This is exactly what it does, right? It prevents people from moving forward in a positive manner in their life, because it creates these additional barriers that only further entrench them into homelessness. And so, of course, there are a lot of barriers. And I think one of the #1 barriers to accessing employment opportunities is exactly that, folks are left with these criminal records, right? And of course, there are a number of different issues that if we talk about access to employment opportunities, right? That there's we could speak to the lack of access to transportation here in San Diego, specifically for folks experiencing homelessness, right? How to get to and from these particular areas. Where are they going to store their belongings, right? So Jonathan mentioned earlier that we manage the transitional storage center in downtown where folks can safeguard their belongings. And it's exactly for this purpose, right? So folks don't have to worry about carrying everything that they own on their backs when they're trying to get to these appointments, when they're trying to get to employment opportunities, right? So that's certainly a huge barrier. Folks have, and the stigma of having to carry all your belongings with you and into an interview. Of course, there's also the barriers of not having access to proper sanitation, right? We can be really candid about folks don't feel comfortable going into spaces, professional spaces, if they haven't showered, if they haven't, maybe shaved, maybe, attended to their hygiene, right? So oftentimes that's also a hindrance for people, trying to get employment opportunities. So we have to be mindful of the different ways, even, the seemingly insignificant ways that these barriers are created in preventing folks from accessing employment opportunities.
Thank you, Michele. This is going to be our last question, and Eve, this is going to be for you. How do we ensure housing security for individuals who are at risk of losing their housing due to the expiration of eviction moratoriums across our state?
Well, that's a good question. Again, I think that when the eviction moratoriums end, folks who are still not working, perhaps are not receiving unemployment insurance anymore, are really going to need rent relief. We can't expect landlords to just continue to not make a profit. I mean, this is just like really this is another reflection of the problems that we face when people don't have access to affordable housing. that allows them to stay housed and with government subsidies, which are really, let's remember, that's us, right? We are the government. And so it's a promise that we make to one another through government programs and via our elected officials, that if any one of us gets into that situation, they won't be forced out onto the street. But we haven't made that promise to one another, and our elected officials certainly haven't, channeled it. So I think my answer is the same as my previous answer. We need affordable housing. We need the government to step in. This is the perfect time for the government to step in with subsidies. This is what the government is for, is to help out when we have market failure, right? We have market failure right now. We have the failure of the economy, which is creating, a massive unemployment. And we sort of like have the failure of our housing because people can't pay their rent. So now's the time. If there was ever a time for the government to step in with subsidies, with direct subsidies, so that people don't lose their housing, it's right now. But I have to tell you, I know that up in Sacramento, these sorts of policies are being entertained, but they're not getting a whole lot of traction yet. So if we want it to happen, we're going to have to push our state legislators and the governor to make it happen. Otherwise, I predict we're going to see a gigantic spike in homelessness in the coming months.
Thank you for sharing, Eve. Well, that wraps up our Q&A portion for tonight's webinar. I'm going to ask that each of the panelists kind of take us away in their closing statements and to share any calls to action they would like us to take after leaving. Jonathan, we'll start with you.
Sorry about that. Sure. So I think that given the intense focus on decriminalization that all of us addressed during this call, I think that's where one of the most important kinds of actions can take place. And the ACLU is part of the Coalition for Police Accountability and Transparency, also called CPAT, which is putting out a call for action or a week of action next week. And throughout the ACLU social media accounts, there'll be information about that posted, so people should follow it, should follow those accounts. One action that they can take right now, that everybody can do right now, is to follow our email action that allows people to send email messages to elected officials at the city and the county level, telling them to adopt CPAT's Police Accountability Now policy package, which includes important decriminalization measures, decriminalizing low-level offenses such as encroachment, which is blocking people's sidewalks, and camping in parks. And the link to take action, Allison has just posted, so people can just follow that link.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. As he stated, the link to the email action is down below, so be sure to click that and follow through with that action. Eve, can you please kick us into your closing statements and call to action?
Sure. So I think for a closing statement, if there's one thing I would want people to take away from this webinar, it's that homelessness, and we've all talked about it, but homelessness is a political problem. It's not a problem of bad or broken people or people making bad choices. And until we start to think of it that way, until we start to think of it as a political problem, we're not going to make a lot of progress. And it's kind of funny because even though I think we all know, right, that we have historic levels of income inequality and wealth inequality, we all know that rent, the cost of rent in the private market has spiraled, causing homelessness. At the same time, and I'm not talking about us panelists, I'm just sort of like talking about us as a society and media accounts and so forth, we really train the microscope on people as if they're the problem, and like, what are their characteristics? What percentage have disabilities, right? All of those people would be housed if we were living in 1970. That's sort of the I think my takeaway message that I would like to leave people with. How this ties into criminalization is that when you criminalize homelessness, the state, which has a lot of legitimacy, is teaching the general public that being homeless, being an unhoused person, is a crime. That really, really undermines our advocacy, as well as being unbelievably cruel. So I always feel that we have to fight these two battles at the same time: decriminalizing homelessness and pushing for affirmative policies that are going to end this crisis, and create a more just and equitable and kind and vibrant world that I think we would all love to be living in. The action that I think is going to be, or has just been dropped into the chat box, is an action that we developed. I work for the ACLU of Southern California. You know, if you sign this petition, it will go to our affiliates, elected officials at both the county and state and city levels, but it will also go to the governor. And so, you know, it's worth it to sign the petition and send this message to the governor, which tells him to immediately pivot to a housing first approach. It's very simple, you know, because this is not rocket science. And that homes are a public health intervention and a form of health care. And that until housing is available for all people who need it, really provide the motel and hotel vouchers. So make sure that Project Roomkey is fully implemented in every part of the state. And that we do recognize that shelters are unsafe places to live during the pandemic under any circumstances, but for those who are still staying in shelters, these shelters need to be held accountable to, I'm telling you, to much higher standards of sanitation than they currently are. They need more oversight. Oversight is very weak, and they exist in a practically unregulated policy environment. When you go to this action, also make sure to listen to, we always try to center the voices of the impacted people who we stand with and by, in our advocacy. And you can listen to Joyce, my conversation, a very short conversation, like a clip of a conversation that I had with Joyce, who is an older adult with multiple underlying health conditions and was sort of stuck in a congregate shelter waiting for a space in Project Roomkey, which was taking a very long time, and her sort of like her fears of contracting COVID and her hopes for the future. So yeah, so that's the action.
Thank you for sharing, Eve. Michele, can you share your action just to wrap us up?
Sure. My colleagues here on this panel have really shared some incredible insight on ways that people can, move towards more effective solutions to addressing homelessness. I do want to share a story before I speak more. When I first started working at Think Dignity, one of my very first clients, and myself as a young attorney ready to work in public interest and change the world one client at a time. I had a client one of my very first clients who I'd been trying to meet with to address his legal needs. We set an appointment at 10 o'clock on 4 separate occasions, and he didn't make it every single time. I thought, most folks start their day at 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock shouldn't be too early for a young man. He was 19 years old. He didn't make it to any of those appointments. He eventually reached out to me for a 5th time to meet him at a park where he was staying at, and I did. And when I met him, I asked him if he had the bank statements that I had been requesting the 4 previous times we tried to meet, and he didn't have it. I asked him why he didn't have it, and he tells me, I didn't have a printer to print it. And I'm like, of course he doesn't have a printer. So I asked him, well, did you try going down to the bank to get the statements printed? And he tells me that he did. but they were going to charge him $3, which he did not have. So I said, okay, let me look up the closest bank. I saw that it was only 2 blocks down the street. I told him that we can walk there together and I would pay the fee for the bank statement so that we can move forward in the legal representation. And he told me that he couldn't walk. And when I asked him why not, I asked him what was wrong. He said it's because his stomach was burning in pain because he couldn't remember the last time he ate. Fortunately, I had a sandwich in my bag that particular day, and I handed it over to him, and we continued on our meeting. And I acknowledged that he didn't eat it right away. So, super fun fact about me, I really love mustard. So this sandwich was, oozing mustard. So I jokingly asked him if it was because I put too much mustard on this sandwich, and he tells me no, that he actually wanted to save the sandwich so that he could split it with his friend, who also had not eaten anything in days. I later found out that the reason he didn't make our 10 o'clock meetings the 4 times prior was because he was literally homeless, unsheltered, living on the streets, and he was too afraid to sleep at night. So he would walk all night long. And in the morning, he would sneak into his friend's apartment, who was living in a transitional living facility where you're not allowed to have guests. But he would sneak in just to get a couple of hours of rest. And by the time he woke up, things were getting ready to close. You know, he had to get to places on foot and things were getting ready to close. And he wasn't able to get a lot of things done. And I share this story because it really shaped my experience as an attorney and really shaped how I viewed myself as an advocate moving forward in this space and specifically for this organization, right? I think that when we talk about homelessness, perhaps the most damaging to the ultimate goal of successfully and effectively addressing homelessness is a narrative of dehumanizing the entire community, right? Because it makes it easier for us to ostracize this community and justify our inaction. But if we view folks as less than human. And I think that's what's been happening here in San Diego, is that we have been viewing folks as less than human. And so now we need to take a stance, right? We need to shift this narrative. We need to change how we look at homelessness, because willful ignorance on these issues is the easy route to take. Taking a blind eye to the mothers, the fathers, the children's, the brothers, the sisters that are living on the streets is easier than confronting homelessness and taking these issues head on. So the more challenging approach than turning a blind eye, but the most needed approach is to take action in investing in our people. So we need to do the work. We need to intentionally shift this narrative of what homelessness looks like. We need to challenge the notion that folks are homeless by choice or because they're non-contributing members of society. We need to expand our knowledge so that we can share what the many faces of homelessness looks like. This includes families, this includes unaccompanied youth, this includes working folks that are homeless because wages are stagnant because of skyrocketing costs of living in San Diego, which makes it nearly impossible for folks to keep up here. So you know, I mentioned earlier that when we talk about homelessness, it's really the end result of this myriad of systematic failures. So we need to invest in closing these gaps within these structures, right? Investing in housing, investing in employment, educational opportunities, so that we can really create these safety nets to catch folks before they even fall into homelessness and before they become entrenched into chronic homelessness. So, you know, simply put, we just need to be proactive in investing in our people. We need to be proactive in helping to shape and change this narrative so that we can view this issue as human-centered. And I think that all of my colleagues, you know, provided different ways that we can, you know, put action into what we do. But I think the easiest way, right? And when I think about the dignity is really to center the dignity of folks living on the streets, right? To view them as whole humans, just like the rest of us. And I think that's going to be wholly important in really changing the conversation around homelessness. And so that's the easiest thing to do, right? Is to have these conversations, have these uncomfortable conversations with folks around you, with your family, with your friends, right? With your colleagues, so that we can all find ways to participate in this process and ensuring that we are supporting the folks that are most in need, specifically in this vulnerable population. I'd like to kind of just add too that Think Dignity is also part of CPAT with the ACLU. So those are, I want to just echo what Jonathan mentioned in following our steps in, supporting our policies that we're pushing forward, which include many police reform issues, but specifically the decriminalization of these low-level quality of life offenses. So I just hope that this webinar, that this information is useful to folks if they didn't know anything about homelessness, right? So they can really start thinking about these issues and finding mindful ways, meaningful ways that they can participate in the process and really help to shift that narrative and support this community as our own.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that story, Michele. Michele, Jonathan, and Eve, thank you so much for the information that you all shared with us today and for the consistent work that you all do in our communities to ensure dignity for homelessness and to ensure homelessness prevention. Thank you to Kayleen, Jennifer, and Andrea for supporting with ASL and Spanish interpretation for our night. And for those of you joining us, I hope that this webinar was informative and inspired you to take the actions, especially the actions shared by our panelists tonight. At the close of our webinar, you will be directed to take a survey where you can share feedback with us. Please be sure to complete the form so that we can improve our webinar experience for others. This webinar was the fourth of our 5-part series. Next week's topic is Education Equity in the Age of COVID-19, which will provide a discussion about the impacts of COVID-19 in our K-12 system. It will include actions you can take to support the work of our partners as well, similar to tonight. You're not going to want to miss it. Thank you all again for joining us this evening as we continue our work to flatten the curve of inequality. Good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, everyone.